when you put on an exhibition of this magnitude, you're interrogating the collection, you're interrogating the history of the collecting in this museum. Could I ask you, Deborah Willis, what have you learned from this interrogation of the Kalamazoo Institute collection of photography?
I believe that what I was excited about for the earlier images when they arrived, I believe that the curators and educators or administrators who started collecting these images had their heart at the pulse of what was going on in the world in the 60s. This is, a time when, as we know, photography is not considered art. So I think that the early curators were thinking for the future, and they understood that these were meaningful objects, but also meaningful artworks. And I believe that that was the important aspect of why they were sensitive enough to think about not only their images from Kalamazoo, their images of the world. They're in Paris, they're in Germany. So we know the Midwest has migration and migrants from around that part of the world in terms of the Europe and that aspect of travel. So thinking about what was important for that time period when these images entered into the collection was, I believe that the curators and educators were thinking about the future and thinking about their audience, and to create a way to open up the doors so that they could interrogate what was going on in the art world, again, because they also had other objects that they were collecting, but considering not photography as representing a story, but creating a story about, sunlight, gesture. So that's where I think that these images were important early on to the individuals who collected them.
Thank you. Could I ask you, Philip, what have you learned from looking at this really fascinating collection that started 1960?
Yeah,
the collecting started at KIA.
Well, I think that one of the key points that you find in this show is that just how ahead of the game the KIA was in 1960 to consider collecting photographs. I mean, that was something that was possible to do at the time, but many museums or art centers wouldn't do that.
Right.
Because photography wasn't really considered a medium that was that was art, that was to be part of a museum collection. A few museums did do that.
Philip, might I briefly interrupt you to share with
Yes.
the audience that when you and I first met a few days ago to talk about this conversation, I mentioned the very important work of the great collector and curator Sam Wagstaff in developing, the partner of Robert Mapplethorpe, in developing serious collections of photography as art. And you said, yes, and that was in the 1970s.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, photography was not, it wasn't really part of the art world, the art market that it is today until the early 1970s, mid 1970s. And so we think about, what sort of how far ahead some institutions were in beginning to develop, in looking at photographs as art and beginning to develop a collection in 1960. I think that's one of the things that I learned that's important. Another is that, I didn't look at the works the way that Deb did, because I wasn't, like assembling an exhibition from them. I was going to write about them, but I think that the work, you know, it's wide ranging, but it's very carefully selected so that one can create a kind of social view of the world, or a social art history from that work. And I think that different than what some other institutions were collecting at the time.
You know, it's funny you're saying that, Philip, because I thought about architecture.
Yeah.
There are so many wonderful photographs of architecture in Europe, 19th century images, Philadelphia. You know, mist is, you know, the mystery of the mist in the kind of atmospheric photographs. And I kept thinking, wow, you know, I'd love to focus on, you know, the architecture, but it would be just larger and larger and larger in terms of expanding the theme. But architecture is also a heavy theme in the collection, and specifically Chicago and
interesting.
and Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a future show to do, because I mean, you know, think about all the things you can learn about the history of a place through the architecture.
Yeah.
And you know, the probably the oldest, but certainly one of the oldest collections of photographs was begun in the kind of late 19th century by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the V&A. And that collection was not developed as a collection of photographs as works of art. They were images that would help the curators to understand and study and categorize decorative arts.
Yes.
So many of the early photographs were images of like ironwork and you know, decorative elements on buildings.
Indeed.
And that's why many of these pictures were made. But then it just so happened that they, you know, in the 19th century, because of that focus, they have, you know, like the best collection of Atget's photographs.
Yes.
Because they subscribed to his pictures, because that's what he photographed.
Right. Well, I wonder, Deborah, if the emphasis on photography in the collection might not be related to Cranbrook, which their photography program had a very important tradition of architectural photography. I wonder, it would be interesting to explore that. Something else that comes out of this exhibition is, you know, building on the early collection of photography from 1960 onwards, is the intimate relationship, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, intentional relationship between local, regional, and international. Might you both be able to speak to that for a moment? I mean, some of the local artists who are included, Mary Whalen, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Whalen, Peggy Michael, Gary Ciardella. And this is something I understand from this exhibition that was there from the get-go when the collection was being put together.
Yeah, I found it fascinating to think about, you know, the region, that it was important to think visually about the water. You know, we have photographs of the Mississippi River from Canada to New Orleans, and we see life on the Mississippi River. But to see the experiences of the using a 19th century process to look at the Kalamazoo River and to just imagine what that experience was like during that time period when it was made, or when just considering how artists are rethinking how to use 19th century processes. But then also with the aspect of objects, you know, women objects, women precious stories that are not necessarily collage or quilted pieces, but what it meant for a woman to have green leather, soft gloves, what it meant to think about evening wear, or not even going out, but just having these objects in their probably passed down from relatives or possibly having opportunities to think about womanhood and that sense of domesticity at that time period. So I think that that's all a part of breathing life into the exhibition through the aspect of the regional story. There's also signage that's in there as well. And how do we read signage in guiding people to, like you said, advertising for objects and or for fishing or directions to places. And so all of that is inviting us as viewers to think about what it meant to be in a place like Kalamazoo, and to think about that as a wholeness in creating not only the metaphor of what it means to travel, but what it means to be still. And here we are, we have the image of a river, we have images of objects and that are reflective of a moment and or of a past. And so these are things that I thought about as I looked at these images.
Wonderful. Philip?
I think the regional story is also critically important to the community where the exhibition is. And so, you know, it gives visitors and people in Kalamazoo a kind of entry into, you know, their own story, their own history, but also then it connects that history to the history of the rest of the world through photographs.
Mm.
So it's a kind of entry point for people from there who may not, you know, have encountered that work before.
That's great to say that, because thinking of the idea of everyone goes to the big city, you know, to Detroit, you know, to San Francisco, to Chicago, to New York, to see great images, but to know that you can find great photography in a region that's not known for collecting in this way. So we can then begin to see the importance of how regional artists' work can be explored through experiences of people coming to see work, and their work as well, so, on display with other photographers who lived in the 19th and 20th century. And see the connection to the contemporary photographers, curators there. Rahema has been actively looking at contemporary photographers and also thinking about the diversity of the collection, you know, making sure that, you know, Black and Latina and Latinx artists are part of this story, part of this narrative, to see work that Dawoud Bey, who is a well-known, you know, photographer who's received a number of awards, and to see his work celebrated in this collection, and to experience that. What he has a show also now at the Whitney. And so we began to think about how regional museums are bringing in works that that people can't go to the Whitney to see the work of Dawoud Bey, but here we see it here in this framework.
My wife, Addie Langford, used to work at the Flint Institute of Arts a number of years ago, and Philippe de Montebello, the former director of the Met, came to give a really, really interesting talk all about the essential role of the regional museum. And he's, you know, he has a French background, and he was not frightened to use the word provincial in the old sense of a province, right? That there is no museum culture worth speaking of if we do not have a strong regional culture, museum culture as well. And it strikes me that you're addressing that. Were women photographers, were women photographers there from the get-go? Was that part, is that something that you're trying to explore leading up to the contemporary emphasis, where I'd like to explore next on questions of identity, for instance? Were women photographers always there from?
Yeah, they were always
foundation?
there. I don't have the actual dates of when the works entered, but they were there early on as well.
Right. And so this is something that the current collection can build upon.
Yes.
Right.
Mhm.